From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Coming up today, K-State's Glynn Tonsor weighs in on the cattle markets. He'll recap another surprising USDA cattle on feed report released last Friday. And Glynn will draw from a new analysis he co-authored on the State of U.S. meat demand. Also today, K-State's Justin Waggoner offers advice for you cattle producers on managing your feeding programs amid high commodity prices, including conducting feedstuff cost comparisons on an equal feed value basis and reducing feed wastage through better processing and feeding management. And on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State's Drew Ricketts on positively identifying snakes that show up around the farmstead. All that here on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we're pleased to have you along with us on this Monday. The cattle markets are our first order of business as we speak once again with livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, K-State Research and Extension. Glynn's on the road today, but is good enough to share his latest thoughts on the cattle trades. And eventually we'll talk about an analysis that he and a colleague have put together looking at the broad topic of meat demand and how it's faring here in 2022. More on that in a moment here. But Glynn, last week, not really much of an enthusing week for the cattle markets. The downward tone was very much evident there.
It was, and some of that's fundamentals in the own industry, and a fair amount of things spill over in the whole commodity space. So anybody that watched the equity markets, comments about consumers reining in, definitely hit the equity markets, and that, I think, showed up in the cattle complex as well. So the cash market, AMS called fed cattle at 138 in Kansas. That'd be about $2 down. The parallel for the board, June live cattle, 131, down a little bit less than $1 on the week. When you look over to feeder cattle, AMS called the Pratt market on Thursday down $2. There were some cases of $4 down. Two lots that I wrote down for context. There was one lot that weighed 81 head at 790 pounds, went for 154, and then a larger lot of 320 head weighing 869 came in at 148. And to round this out here and look at the board, the August feeder cattle contract closed at 164, is down a full $4. The last thing I noted on the market, the cutout held out just a little bit better than the cattle complex. Choice on Friday was 262, was actually up $3 from the Friday before. However, select slipped by $1. It closed at 243 this past Friday. So put a bow on that. Most of the numbers I shared there were negative. The largest decline would be in the feeder cattle contract looking out to August. Again, we have some evidence. We're going to talk about the cattle on feed report in a moment. Cattle being pulled forward again, and just some grain clouds on the horizon on consumer demand, I think, is in the backdrop.
About that USDA cattle on feed report, it came out Friday, and for the second month in a row, it has featured surprises that sort of took the market aback. Share the numbers with us. Yeah,
so I'll just give the three here and put some context on expectations. Was the on-feed May 1st number was plus 2%, which was not necessarily a surprise. It was up a little bit, so the mean of expectations was up 1.5%. So it was on the upper end of the range, basically, the pre-report expectations. And the mean driver of that was the placement number. So April placements came in down 1%. The mean expected number was basically a 4% decline, and the lowest decline was a 2% decline. So placements came in with less of a decline. So placements were higher than expected. That's the biggest surprise in this report. April marketings were down 2%, right on par with what was expected. Overall, when you merge the timestamp May 1st and the movement in April, both placements and marketings as I outlined there, the placements is a surprise, and it reflects an ongoing pulling forward of cattle. Certainly drought conditions in the weeks leading up to that and through a good chunk of April for a fair amount of the country are part of that. But we got to also take note, it's not just drought, it's higher input cost. At the end of the day, it's the ability to feed as well as have an expected return that makes you want to keep animals around. It's that combination. So I think we have higher placements in some cases, not because of drought, but just because of higher input cost and what that's doing in margins. So overall, I'd say that cattle on feed report is a bit bearish here in the near term. When I say near term, think this week, next week, and it just continues to multiply and kind of magnify the story of pulling cattle forward. We're going to have fewer in the upcoming months. that probably will first show up in some stronger demand, stronger chasing of feeder cattle. Probably the first thing we see once we start struggling to find cattle put in the feed yard. And then subsequently, particularly looking at 2023, I think it sets the stage for higher fed cattle prices as long as beef demand holds up.
Well, tying that then to your latest feedlot return calculations as of the middle part of May here, this is the number that you feature month by month on net returns to feeding cattle. As anticipated, this was going to drift into red ink, and next month, that will be the case, according to the numbers.
Yeah, so these are timestamped May 11th, as you noted. June's basically a break-even projected month for Kansas steers here in this exercise. And then July through November, and when I say this, I'm talking about cattle leaving the yard and closeouts of those months, are projected to be losses before the story changes by December, January, projected gains. What's underneath that is continued increases in cost of gain as we go from now till Christmas are projected. And yes, there are projected increases in sales prices, but not enough to offset the projected higher feeder cattle placement price with that higher cost of gain. So the margin squeeze is well in play for a unhedged, forward-looking Kansas feed yard.
Let's go to the demand side then, and the latest meat demand monitor numbers that you have on beef. Again, you do this on a monthly basis. It is a national survey of consumers here. And what are they saying about their interest in beef product, Glynn?
So I think there's some evidence of consumers tightening the belt. So demand is still up from a pre-pandemic perspective compared to a couple of years ago. I don't want to mislead people there. But retail, so think grocery store demand, for the two beef as well as the two pork items we tracked in this series, was down in April compared to March. Food service was up a little bit, but that's a little bit misleading because it was down in March. There's examples both in this effort as well as in other data sets that consumers are adjusting to higher prices, again, not just in the meat category, but in inflation all the way around. Net pay hits are occurring for a lot of consumers. Mm-hmm. One thing we look at in this April series for the Meat Demand Monitor is about 70% indicate they've made some change in response to higher meat prices. So about 30% say they're not doing anything different, 70% say they are. And the most common adjustment is they're buying the same thing. So they're buying the same brand or non-branded cut, same package size and the like, but they're simply buying a lower volume. Other people are indicating they're buying fewer packages, a different cut, or they're adjusting the brand. Of course, there's other adjustments you can make. But what I want to drive home there is only about a third are saying they haven't made change, and over two-thirds are indicating they're starting to make changes. And that would line up with a lot of things outside the meat category. I think the meat complex has been fortunate that they've had strong meat demand throughout the pandemic, and as we've progressed through 2022, it's been pretty good. But I don't think the meat complex is going to be immune to discretionary income getting squeezed. I think that's what we're seeing.
On the other hand, and now we'll talk about an effort that you and Purdue University's Jason Lusk put together, basically assessing meat demand broadly as opposed to what you've termed meat avoidance. You used your meat demand monitor data for this analysis, and you were trying to get at this notion of how meat demand is bearing up in the face of, naysayers regarding meat consumption.
Yeah, so Jason and I and my colleague at Purdue that several of our listeners have heard me collaborate with in the past, we use both long-term historical data from USDA and more recent meat demand monitor data, which we just give a summary on. That's beef and pork checkoff, recent, I think the last couple of years, and more household-oriented, to summarize the status as well as the history of U.S. meat demand. Mm-hmm. And as you kind of teed it up, and I'll just give the title, is Meat Demand Outdoes Meat Avoidance, is the title of this paper that Jason and I wrote. And we're not cooking the books when we say this, but rather we're trying to provide some data-driven, factual context that there's a long history and a recent experience where meat demand is very robust here in the U.S., yet there's a lot of chatter in the realm of what you might call meat avoidance, so concerns about, impact on human health and the environment and so forth. And those discussions are going to continue. We're not even saying they should stop, but rather we're trying to give context on the average U.S. consumer is still a heavy protein consumer. Meat is a big part of their diet. There's a key role for taste, freshness, and safety in protein purchasing decisions that the Meat Demand Monitor allows us to outline and document. And it's consistent with how you can have strong meat demand even when there's ongoing, interest in the general media about topics like health, environment, animal welfare. It's not to say those topics are going away, and I'm not saying they're wrong, but we try to provide some context on they're not driving protein purchasing decisions for the typical person. And that's how this adds up to our title, where meat demand outdoes meat avoidance.
What people can draw from this then is some reassurance about beef demand and the cattle industry's future moving forward?
On balance, yes. And to drive that forward even more, in this paper, Jason, I focused on domestic meat demand. You and I have talked only domestic here today, but there's growing global protein demand as well. And the U.S. beef and pork industries are well positioned for that. So I would say not only yes domestically, but also on the foreign market as well. So there's reasons for optimism. I'm well aware that we have higher input costs and the like that are creating challenges, but we can't lose sight of the fact that global protein demand overall, and certainly long term, we get past, I hope, some inflation pressures here. There's a lot of reasons for optimism. Is
there a place somebody can get a glance at this article, Glynn, by chance?
Yeah, so we cross-link it from our Ag Manager Meat Demand Monitor page. You can get to it that way. It's published in a journal called Meat Science. And as usual, if you struggle to get hold of it, you're welcome to email me. You can find my email on our Key State Ag Manager website. Or as I usually joke, Eric, just Google bald economist that likes to play basketball, and you'll probably get my emails.
Many avenues to reach Glynn. The article is entitled Meat Demand Outdoes Meat Avoidance. You can check that out. agmanager.info is a good place to start tracking that down. Glynn, we always appreciate your comments. Take care. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me on, Eric.
He's Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension on the cattle markets. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today is back now. Well, you beef cattle producers have put up with a lot of changes in the economics of your business over the years, and this year is one for the books, with a lot of things coming together to put the economic pinch on making, in our case today, cattle feeding work out. Joining us here is Justin Waggoner via phone. Justin, as you know, is a beef systems specialist, K-State Research and Extension, based in southwest Kansas. And in a recent Animal Sciences and Industry newsletter article out of K-State, he shared some tips for managing through high commodity prices. And those, Justin, are part of what could be easily termed an economic avalanche that cattle feeders are dealing with at the moment, is it not?
I think that's correct. Eric, no matter how we put it, I think we're in the midst of some very challenging times for really all segments of the cattle industry. I mean, if we look at the cow-calf sector and the persistence of drought, and especially the southwest corner of the state where I'm located at, we know that some regions of the state have received some measurable rainfall here recently, but we're still dealing with drought in a very large chunk of the state. And then increased commodity prices and, what we're experiencing now in terms of fuel prices. There's a lot going on that our producers are certainly faced with right now.
One of the things that you point out in this article is how to evaluate the cost of those commodities and what metrics, if you will, to go by there.
We have a lot of producers right now that are looking at many different types of alternative feedstuffs that they may or may not be familiar with. Anything that's an alternative to corn, I think right now would have a lot of interest from producers. And so really what's important as we look at pricing, commodities into the ration is we always want to evaluate those commodities on a cost per unit of energy or cost per unit of crude protein basis on a dry matter basis. And what that really allows us to do is that allows us to compare those feedstuffs, which may be very different in terms of their composition, silage versus, some sort of lower quality grass hay, and evaluate that on really an apples to apples basis. We may have an apple and an orange, but if we do it on a dry matter basis, we can, appropriately evaluate those two commodities. We also have to take into account, things like freight. That's gone up quite dramatically here recently. Processing costs, as well as commodity shrink, should also be included in some of those. So, we kind of take that fundamental equation of, well, make all those things on a dry matter basis, calculate dollars per unit of energy, dollars per unit of protein, but we also have to factor in some of those other issues like shrink.
How does one effectively get at that cost per unit of either energy or crude protein? What can they use as resources there?
Well, it mostly starts with, doing a good job of communicating with whomever is brokering those commodities, and it starts within the nutrient analysis, knowing exactly what the nutrient composition of the feedstuff that you're looking at is, what the dry matter composition of that feedstuff is going to be, how much energy is in that, and how much protein. And then once we go beyond that, it's just kind of simple mathematics of cost per ton, cost per dry matter ton, and then cost of whatever nutrient we're looking at and putting that on a dry matter ton basis.
One thing you're also encouraging here, Justin, that is a producer should look around, if you will, and see what they have on hand in the way of potential feedstuffs here. Take full advantage of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at a situation where we're certainly in a high commodity cost environment, many times our cheapest feedstuffs are going to be those that we can produce on farm. In many situations, we produce a lot of forages on farm if we're a grower or a backgrounding operation, silage, hays. And, if you look at it, really what we have, we need to put a fair value on those, but typically it's going to be lower than if we went out to the market and tried to purchase those, right? And, I like to come back to kind of an old saying that, the best way to make a profit with land and livestock is to walk the crops off the farm, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's something to always think about. If you've got a planting opportunity that might be out there to plant something that could be potentially used as a forage crop in a cattle operation, I think that's something worth considering, although we do have record high grain prices as well. So, there's a little bit of give and take in there in terms of the overall operation, but I think that is certainly something to think about. If there's an opportunity to use an on-farm commodity, certainly put a fair value on the price of that, but it's certainly worth considering as well.
One thing that is brought up from time to time, and it often gets lost in the shuffle, how to assure that one is using what commodities they have most efficiently, and that is to say through the storage and the presentation of that feedstuff. Sometimes there's waste involved here.
Yes, absolutely. We mentioned it, in our first bullet point in terms of evaluating those commodities and shrink losses. How much of a given product are we going to lose, depending on how we're storing it. For example, some commodities that may be very prone to wind losses if they're stored in an open pile or a three-sided commodity bay or something of that nature. And so it's always a good idea to really take a second look and go, okay, how much of the feed that I'm purchasing actually makes it to the feed bunk? And that is a difficult number to track, but, in most operations, we're looking at losses that are going to range from 2 to 10%. Now, for certain commodities, that may be well higher than that 10% level, but that's always a good number. It always is beneficial to put some number in terms of shrink loss. It would be very rare for us to, retain all of that feedstuff if we take into account, getting it from the commodity bay into the mixer wagon. We're always going to have losses, right? But the thing is that those losses, even though they may be small, start to add up. If you figure, 1% of a ton is 20 pounds, 1% of 20 tons is 400 pounds, and so you can start to see how that 400 pounds at, say, like $250 per ton, that starts to add up in terms of what we're losing in terms of shrink losses or just waste in a given operation, that we may be able to make some small changes just in terms of, ingredient or commodity order that we're loading them into the mixer wagon or something of that extent, or maybe putting up a simple windbreak might be something else that the producer could consider as well.
And efficiency in actually utilizing those feedstuffs, making sure cattle are getting the most out of them. And there are a few management tips that can be helpful in that respect, you say.
Absolutely. To focus on efficiency, if we look at some of the key benchmarks in just feeding livestock in general, feed to gain and feed conversion are always going to be important. Yeah. It's going to be one of the benchmarks that we would evaluate different feeding programs on, right? And so we know that there are certain feeding technologies like ionophores or even management strategies like limit feeding where we can improve our feed conversions. And so, if you're not utilizing some of those technologies, or you're not currently looking at your feed conversions very closely in your operation, I would certainly encourage a producer to do that. It does take a little bit of additional effort to measure some of those things in terms of the pounds of feed that are being delivered to a bunk, having a process by which you can total those up and then look at the animal output as well. So input relative to output, right? The kind of the key measures of efficiency, right? And so I think that's always something to come back to, is just those fundamentals of where are we really at in terms of our efficiency of the operation.
Amidst all of this, one does not by any means want to jeopardize or compromise livestock performance, cattle performance in this case. And so having all the advice available certainly doesn't hurt. If one could lean on the input of a nutritionist, that can be quite helpful here, can it not?
Absolutely. Whether or not that's a professional consulting nutritionist, or you're relying on resources like K-State Research and Extension to provide some of that expertise back to you. If you're going through some of these challenges and you're looking at your feeding operation and you feel like you need a little assistance, I would certainly encourage producers to reach out. A lot of times nutritionists do much, much more beyond just simply balancing a ration and putting those numbers together. There's a whole host of other facets of the operation where they're going to be able to provide some additional expertise. We talked about shrink, we've talked about feed waste, we've talked about some of those other issues here today, and those are some areas where they can often have some valuable inputs in terms of just making some, what I would hope would be measurable changes to that operation, which hopefully results in some efficiency gains as well as some increases in animal performance.
And as per that extension information and the resources available, touch base with your local extension agricultural agent as a starting point, if nothing else. No lack of hurdles for our cattle producers to clear in whatever circumstances they might be, given higher commodity prices and the things that are affecting their operations otherwise. So in closing, Justin, it's just a matter of producers analyzing it to the fullest, where they're at and what they need to do.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your time, as always. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks.
Justin Waggoner, Beef Systems Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, with us. This article, by the way, in the latest Animal Sciences and Industry newsletter, the May edition, which you can find at asi.ksu.edu, on tips for managing high commodity prices. You are listening to Agriculture Today, and next up, this week's Wildlife Management segment after this break over the K-State Radio Network. We are back now on this Agriculture Today, and we set aside this part of each Monday's broadcast to talk wildlife management, this time with wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts of K-State Research and Extension, who's on the receiving end of calls once again this point of the spring. Drew, you tell us about snakes showing up in homes, around farmsteads, so forth, and they are getting after it because of the change in the weather, you say.
Yeah. So most of our snake, or all of our snake species, go dormant over the wintertime, and they're mostly below ground or under logs or beneath rocks and those sorts of things. And as it warms up, they become active again, and lots of folks who are not necessarily excited to see snakes start seeing them again. And so I get lots of pictures and phone calls and that sort of thing.
And folks get antsy about the, quote, threat that those snakes might pose. But of all the species, you say, that thrive in Kansas, only a handful are even remotely threatening.
That's true. So we have around 40 species of snakes in Kansas. 5 of them are venomous. And so the vast majority of snakes that folks see on a regular basis are non-venomous species. Most of them are beneficial. They eat rodents. They eat other snakes, including venomous species. They eat insects. And so there's lots of things that they do for us that actually benefit us rather than being a problem.
So you'd rather folks not conduct a crusade against snakes?
Well, I think it's important to recognize the benefits of them. And I for sure understand why folks are fearful of snakes. And I think the best thing that folks can do to reduce that fear is to learn how to identify snakes.
And let's get into that as much as we can in our time today.
Yeah. So we do have a really good publication on the wildlife.kstate.edu website that shows how to do this. But when we're thinking about identifying snakes, the venomous species will have a much more triangular head. They've got big venom sacs that are sort of located behind their jaws, and so that gives that rounded arrowhead appearance to their head. Some of the non-venomous species will flatten their head out to make it look more triangular and try to mimic a venomous snake. Of course, rattlesnakes have a rattle on their tail. Right. And the first thing I see when I see a venomous snake is just how stocky they are relative to their length. They're going to be really girthy, really wide compared to a lot of other snake species. They also, if you get close enough, there's some other things that you can see. Our venomous snakes are pit vipers, and so in addition to the nasal opening, they'll have a pit on the front of their head, and then the pupils are another thing that you can look at. So the non-venomous species have a round pupil, whereas the venomous species have an elliptical or that cat-like sort of vertical pupil that you can see as well.
Folks might not get close enough, though, to read those eyes,
right.
though. So these other telltale signs will be helpful. And most snakes, even the venomous to a certain extent, are not necessarily aggressive until you invade their habitat.
That's right. When we look at the statistics for snake bites by venomous species, more than half of the people who were bit by a venomous snake were actually handling that snake. And I think a lot of times folks may not know how to identify snake species, and so they pick one up and then they're bit by it, and then that turns into a whole nother problem.
Right. Use that information from Extension on identifying snakes. It'll take care of any questions about what snake is what. If there is a nuisance snake, venomous or not, is there a tried and true method of maybe moving them along, Drew?
There are snake tongs and different ways that we can get a hold of them, maybe even a big stick or a hoe. The other thing is, just giving them their space. If you see a snake, you don't know if it's venomous or not, just give it some space and it'll probably move on. And then reducing habitat in the yard or around the farmstead is also important. So the more rock piles of lumber, wood piles, and those sorts of things we have, the more snakes we're probably going to see.
Well, distinguish between the dangerous snakes and the beneficials, for, as Drew says, they provide a lot of positive aspects in their activity. We'll talk again soon, Drew. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Drew Ricketts, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension, with us. And our time's away once more. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.